My name is Candice Owley. I'm the retired president of the Wisconsin Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals. And I'm currently the coordinator of the Wisconsin Labor History's annual remembrance of the bloodiest labor event in Wisconsin history. A moment when workers in our community of Bayview, Wisconsin, came together in peaceful protest as they marched and tragically died in their fight for the 8-hour day. This massacre of workers occurred on May 5th, 1886, and each year on the first Sunday in May, the Wisconsin Labor History Society, in cooperation with the Bayview History Society, hold a remembrance ceremony to keep alive the memory and the importance of these workers' sacrifice. This year, however, is very unique because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, the coronavirus, the first in 100 years. So it means we can't gather together in person. So instead, we are holding a virtual event to remember the Bayview tragedy. I believe the importance of the workers' struggle and massacre seems even more important at this moment because the pandemic has exposed so many of the same issues that led to the uprising in the 1880s. Right today, workers, especially healthcare workers, are dying because of the lack of protective equipment. The pandemic has also laid bare the lack of a social safety net for workers. They have no universal health care, they have no right to paid time off, and the severe income inequality caused by the closure of so many industries is causing thousands to line up at food banks. We know the marches and the strikes in the late 1880s caused many people to realize the need for working people to unite to improve working conditions, economic conditions, and living conditions. That same dynamic is made evident today because of the pandemic. And hopefully the good that will come from so much death and economic destruction will bring to birth that new world that we also desperately need. But let's take a moment to turn our attention to the world of the 1880s. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, like many northern cities in the 1800s, began to experience what would be called the Great Industrial Revolution. The city was rapidly becoming a critical center of industry. As factories developed, they began to push for ever greater production. The result of this effort was growing worker oppression. Workers were not yet united to fight the oppression, but they were united in the common experiences of the time. Poverty wages, unsafe working conditions, child labor, long work days with no benefits such as sick leave or paid time off. The experience of the workers in the industrial centers found common cause when a new national union, the Knights of Labor, emerged in the early 1880s. The new labor union united workers in a demand for an 8-hour day for the same work wages as the brutal 12 hours that they were being forced to work. The call for the 8-hour day inspired marches and labor strikes across the country. By 1886 in Milwaukee, the cry for the 8-hour day led to a call for a general strike. This call in the May of 1886 set the stage for what was to become the bloodiest labor incident in Wisconsin history.
Thank you, Candice. We're sorry we cannot be here in person to commemorate the tragedy, but we're glad to be here telling the story virtually in an online format. So that first week of May 1886 was a watershed in Milwaukee's and America's history. May 1st was set as the deadline for the adoption of the 8-hour day without a cut in pay. And by that time, some employers had agreed to that condition, including the city of Milwaukee itself and some smaller employers. The larger ones had not. So on the first day of May, that was kind of the signal for the start of labor actions. May 2nd, which was a Sunday, and don't forget the only day off in those long weeks of long days. There was a parade downtown that included every band in the entire city, 3,000 marchers and about 20,000 spectators, which back in those years was a major share of Milwaukee's population. So on the morning of May 3rd, that Monday morning when the work week began again, there was a general strike that pretty much shut down the city And people marched around the city, workers marched around the city trying to dramatize their demand for the 8-hour day. And the result was they closed the breweries, they closed the Milwaukee road shops, they closed the EPL's Reliance Works in Walker's Point. The last employer who remained open was the Bayview Rolling Mill, which was the first heavy industry in Milwaukee, opened way back in 1868. And the largest employer for years, 1,500 workers back in the 1870s. So a crowd of roughly 1,000 strikers marched down from the south side, largely Polish, on the morning of May 4th. And they found the militia waiting for them by that time. Governor Jeremiah Rusk had called out the militia. And they were incensed, the strikers were, when they found a lot of those militia were their neighbors and their fellow parishioners. A lot of the Polish Kościuszko Guard, which was kind of the early version of the National Guard, had been called out to defend the plant, to defend order. So the strikers showered their neighbors and countrymen with sticks and stones and a lot of verbal abuse. And finally, the mill said, we will close down, but the workers made it very clear they intended to come back the next morning. So that night, May 4th, 1886, is when there was a gathering for the same 8-hour day without a cut and pay down in Chicago in the Haymarket area on the west side of Chicago's Loop. When it was breaking up, someone threw a bomb into a crowd of policemen, killing 8 and wounding several others. So that was electric. You know, that was, the news was spread through the telegraph wires like lightning. So there was this unbearably tense atmosphere in Milwaukee on the morning of May 5th, but that did not deter the workers from coming down and dramatizing their demands. So the morning of May 5th, 1886, roughly 1,500 strikers, most of them Polish, gathered at St. Stanislaus Church on 5th and Mitchell and marched 4 abreast down Mitchell, then down Kinnickinnick, and then down Bay Street. And the mill was at that point about 200 yards away. The militia was waiting for them, and at a distance of roughly 200 yards, the captain of the militia gave the order to halt. And by this time, the governor had moved to Milwaukee, relocated to Milwaukee, and he was apprised of the crowd marching in the Bayview Rolling Mill. And he said, very well, sir, fire on them. So this was a situation that was just primed for disaster. A captain of one of the militia companies said to his men, pick out your man and kill him. So this was lethal force. This was something that they were not simply going to fire over the heads of the strikers. So at a distance of roughly 200 yards, there is no way the strikers could have heard the militia commander, much less even seen him. So when they kept on marching, the militia captain gave the order to fire. And by the time the smoke had cleared, roughly 7 people had died. I found certificates for at least 5 people, and the reports range as high as 9, but we've settled on 7 as number of fatalities. And that included a 13-year-old schoolboy who was playing hooky and a retired mill worker who was just watching from his backyard. So they ran pell-mell back to the city, and there are these, it's like reports from a war zone. Priests giving the last rites in their vestments on railroad embankments to workers who were on their lifeblood was bleeding away into the green grass. You know, these very colorful descriptions from essentially a war zone here in Milwaukee. So this was by any measure the bloodiest and most tragic labor disturbance in Wisconsin's history. And it ended the 8-hour movement, but by no means did it end the struggle for workers' rights, better conditions, and set the stage. It was in fact a catalyst for what we know today as the workers' rights in the 21st century. So this was certainly by no means the end, but here's Beth Jozwiak to tell the story of what happened in the aftermath of May 5th, 1886.
Well, like elsewhere with the 8-hour day movement and the protests that occurred, the employers and politicians used this as a way to condemn the labor movement and blame them for the violence. We see that the Knights of Labor moves into a decline in this era of the late 1880s. However, the new union, the American Federation of Labor, begins to expand, and in Wisconsin we see this both at the state level and in Milwaukee, with the establishment of the Federated Trades Council in Milwaukee, which was largely the instigator of the Wisconsin Federation of Labor. In Milwaukee, this Federation Federated Trades Council increases in membership over the years, ultimately becoming quite prominent with thousands of members and over 60 locals. And politically, the labor movement begins to really make an effort to elect politicians who agree with their goals, whether it's 8-hour day, factory safety, public ownership of railroads, etc. We see the growth in the populist movement in Milwaukee as well as in the state, and the socialist movement as well. Oftentimes the populists and the socialists work together. Sometimes they compete with each other or fight with each other, but ultimately they both share the goals of improving this situation for workers. In Milwaukee, in 1898, we see the establishment of the Social Democratic Party, which had a very close tie, or very close ties to the labor movement in Milwaukee as well as Wisconsin. And one of the things that we see with the socialist movement, besides its labor efforts, is to really establish so-called honest government. And they really prided themselves on not being corrupt, being honest, being practical, achieving things for the benefit of workers overall, whether it was municipal ownership of the streetcar lines, municipal ice house, free textbooks for school children, 8-hour day, at least in the city where they could get it. And this is really important part of Milwaukee labor history, but also Wisconsin history as well. Ultimately, the socialists increased their share of the votes, getting more and more members on the city council, as well as in the county government. And in 1910, they elect the first socialist mayor, Emil Zeidel, who had been an alderman before becoming mayor. In 1910, the socialists won 21 of the 35 aldermanic seats, and also 10 of the county supervisor positions. Unfortunately, they're defeated in 1912 when the Democrats and the Republicans bond together in what was called the fusion ticket to defeat the socialists. But they maintain an influence and they maintain their ties with the labor movement. And so that combination of the Socialist Party, the labor movement, and others who they allied with, sometimes some of the labor leaders didn't like the socialists, but ultimately that push for benefiting the workers both in Milwaukee and statewide, it has a long legacy.
Hey, Beth, if I could add something that happened in between the socialist victory in 1910 and the marching back in 1886, there was, in the fall elections of 1886, there was such a revulsion, such a reaction to the shootings down in Bayview, that the People's Party was founded, and it was largely people who were active in the 8-hour movement just a few months before. And they won most of the county offices in that election, the assembly offices, and sent a millwright named Henry Smith to Congress. So Mr. Smith went to Washington, is what happened in fall of 1886, and went in on the people's ticket. And that was in many ways kind of a precursor and kind of a warning, in a sense, of what was coming with socialism that proved to be a much more durable movement.
Yeah, and Henry Smith actually sometimes would be a sort of a part of a alliance with the socialists at times, even though they disagreed with each other on many things, in issues in city government and that sort of thing. So Henry Smith pops up sometimes in city issues later on as well.
Yeah, hi. So, first of all, I want to just say that, having spoke at last year's Bayview commemoration, it's sort of maybe not a major tragedy, but a minor tragedy that we can't celebrate this in person this year. It really speaks to the unprecedented circumstances we're facing. And when I think about the historical legacy of the 1886 8-hour strikers, what I think about is sort of connecting the things that they were struggling for with some of the things that working people are struggling for today. And I think one thing that connects those two things is to really put this in the American idiom, the sort of continuous American struggle were those things that were promised when our nation was founded: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if you think about what those 8-hour workers fought and some of them died for in 1886, it really was about that idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that American society should fight to make sure that everybody's lives were good. And what that really meant, I think, in 1886, just as in 1776, and just as it does today, is it means self-determination. So just follow me for a second. You know, the 8-hour movement, of course, was about how much people had to work during the day. But what it really was about not having all those workers' lives dictated by their bosses and their quest to just maximize profits. So 8 hours, of course, is about limiting the workday, but it's also about having more time for rest, having time to spend with family, having time to spend with the community, learning things, having more time for political engagement. So those are really the stakes in 1886. It was about, were working people's lives going to be determined by themselves or by their bosses? And so, you know, we've heard a lot about the history already of the immediate aftermath. Beth did a really great job of talking about that. But, you know, even though these workers didn't immediately get the 8-hour day, they were part of thousands, millions of workers taking action to make their lives better. And ultimately, it may have taken 50 years, but ultimately, the federal government in the New Deal ended up you know, actually guaranteeing an 8-hour workday. And that's become both legally binding, but also something that we accept in our sort of, you know, cultural common sense. Now, granted, those things are under threat today, but, you know, I think the long-term view is that those workers most certainly in 1886 did not give their lives in vain. And I want to just speak for a second to how this equates, how we can, you know, sort of have a level of you know, maybe trans-historical solidarity with these folks from 1886. You know, clearly we are facing a precarious moment for working people, but the precarity and the really difficult conditions people are working under, are working under now, you know, started before the COVID-19 crisis. So even though we had, you know, record unemployment rates, there's still millions of workers who wanted full-time jobs that didn't have them. There were still millions of workers who didn't have health care. And there were still millions of workers who had no, you know, sort of good prospects for long-term economic security. And, you know, that again, all predated the COVID-19 crisis. In fact, there's some stat like, I think I've got it right. Something like 40% of Americans didn't have $400 for an emergency. And this is not like some, you know, left-wing news site. This is the Federal Reserve that actually got that data. So people were already in precarious situations before COVID-19. And why were they in those situations? Well, they were in those situations because, call it what you want, I prefer to call it concerted class war from above. Workers have had their lives basically dictated to them more and more by their bosses. They've had they've had a concerted effort to prevent them from being able to join together to bargain collectively and give them some semblance of to somewhat balance the scales of power that exist in our society. So there's numerous examples we could point to, whether it's the army of corporate consultants that companies use now to prevent working people from organizing and exercising their rights to collective bargaining. There are the free trade deals like NAFTA that were negotiated when you have American companies who have basically been licensed to seek cheaper labor elsewhere and turn their back on their obligation to American workers, even though they get tax breaks in the United States and sell their products here. You know, you've got more recently Act 10, which effectively took away collective bargaining rights for public employees in our state. You've got the spate of right to work laws in the upper Midwest, the so-called right to work laws, which make it more difficult for workers to organize. So these are put in place by powerful interests. And so the COVID-19 crisis has simply exacerbated some of those things, right? You now have 17 million workers and counting who are filing unemployment benefits. That's just in the past few weeks. Millions of those workers have lost healthcare. And even those people that have jobs, some of those people who are lucky enough to still have jobs, they're seeing their working conditions sped up. they're being forced to work in conditions in which, their health is being threatened. And so, what we really have to do now to carry on the legacy of the workers in Bayview in 1886 is fight for solidarity so that we working people can have control over their own lives again. And so, I know the situation is dire, but there are a number of things that I think we're seeing that should make us hopeful. Number one, we're several years into a national teacher uprising. We've got labor leaders like Sarah Nelson of the Flight Attendants Union who are calling for a general strike when we see the president, capriciously sort of shut down the government. And we've got Amazon workers who are standing up against enormous odds against one of the country's most lucrative corporations, standing up for their own health and safety. So, I think to kind of bring everything together, whether it's 1776, 1886, or today, the 8-hour movement is about self-determination for working people, right? And the way to get that is through solidarity, building solidarity. And in moments of crisis, that's when we can really build solidarity. And, hopefully today, working people can build on the kind of efforts for solidarity that we saw in 1886 and recognize that what our society should really be about is ensuring that everybody has the right to an economic livelihood, the right to be healthy and safe, and at a very sort of basic level, the right to make futures that are better than our past.
Okay, we've heard today about the past of the events of May 5th, 1886. We've heard about where they came from and what they led to in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And as Jon so eloquently expressed it, this is a continuing struggle for self-determination and self-respect on the part of working people around the country. This is an evergreen theme that goes back to 1886 and is still relevant in 2020. And here's Harvey Kaye to give us a poem that makes those same points.
The poem I chose is I Am the People, the Mob by Carl Sandburg. It seems most appropriate for commemorating the Bayview Massacre. Now, it's important to realize that Sandburg was from Illinois, but he learned about labor and left politics here in Wisconsin. After moving around the country and trying out a host of jobs, he came to Wisconsin in 1907 to work for the Socialist Party as an organizer up here in the northeastern part of the state, Green Bay, Appleton, the lakeshore towns and cities. He then headed down to Milwaukee to serve as secretary to the city's first socialist mayor, Emile Seidel, from 1910 to 1912. And a year later, he moved to Chicago, where he penned this poem. In it, Sandburg speaks to the radical democratic power of memory, to the possibility of working class liberation if, instead of forgetting, we start remembering. I Am the People, the Mob, by Carl Sandburg. Do you know that all the great work of the world is done through me? I'm the working man, the inventor, the maker of the world's food and clothes. I'm the audience that witnesses history. The Napoleons come from me and the Lincolns. They die, and then I send forth more Napoleons and Lincolns. I'm the seed ground. I'm a prairie that will stand for much plowing. Terrible storms pass over me. I forget. The best of me is sucked out and wasted. I forget. Everything but death comes to me and makes me work and give up what I have, and I forget. Sometimes I growl, shake myself, and spatter a few red drops for history to remember. Then I forget. When I, the people, learn to remember, when I, the people, use the lessons of yesterday and no longer forget who robbed me last year, who played me for a fool, then there will be no speaker in all the world say the name, the people, with any fleck of a sneer in his voice or any far-off smile of derision. The mob, the crowd, the mass will arrive then. Thank you.
The years roll around and they yellow the page, but the history of labor don't mellow with age. The blood in the workers will always run red when the winds blow a time for a change. The ground here is hallowed, it's haunted, they say, by the ghost of the workers that came here in May. when the killing was seen as a duty by some to put down the 8-hour day. Now here in Bayview it's all quiet today, but you still hear 'em call for an 8-hour day. The sound of the rifles has faded away, the bones of the rolling mill gone to decay, and only the hall where the puddlers met still stands like an 8-hour day.